Hello, Politics Plus Media 101 listeners. Today we're going to be having a discussion about the US, China, and Latin America. This conversation is instigated perhaps by a big story about China developing an intelligence facility on the island of Cuba. And we're here, I think, with the person who's probably really the perfect person to talk to about this topic. I would say that he wrote the book about it, but in fact, he actually wrote 4 books about China and Latin America, and that's Dr. Evan Ellis. Dr. Evan Ellis is a senior associate in the Americas program at CSIS, who provided many of our best guests on this podcast. And he is also a research professor of Latin American studies at the Army War College. So, Evan, could you tell us a little bit about, your research and the books that he wrote about China and Latin America?
Sure, John. It's a pleasure to be on the program. I've been following China and Latin America for about 21 years now, from the time that I was in the private sector. And so I've had the opportunity to see it and the perceptions of China in Latin America, as well as Latin America within China, evolve and those relationships evolve. Again, I'm currently working as the research professor for Latin America at the U.S. Army War College, and so my responsibility there is to take a look at how China, as well as Russia and other actors, are working in the region, as well as other issues such as transnational organized crime. The books that I've written over the years, the first one that I wrote in 2009 was really focused on what was going on with China in the region, something that was relatively new at the time. The second book that I'd written took a look at the more strategic dimensions, taking a look at the information space, military engagement, and other issues along those lines. The third book was a little bit more focused on the commercial dimension, understanding that Chinese companies from about 2010 had started investing in a major way in establishing a presence on the ground in sectors from mining to telecommunications to others. And of course, my most recent book, which just came out last year, focuses more on understanding the various different dimensions of the evolving relationship, everything from the fight over Taiwan to the political military dimensions, as well as some of the ways in which China's engagement is transforming the region and its actors.
So much of what you just described are topics that I'm interested in us exploring and getting into later in this conversation. But first, it's interesting how at U.S. institutions, we've got people who are asked to be Africa experts or Latin America experts. And it's remarkable, isn't it? Because it's dozens and dozens of countries that you have to track and follow and keep up on the news when things are happening all the time. How many elections a year are there in the Latin American broader region? Probably, 10 or more, right?
Well, and this has really made the China-Latin America topic so complex, because in many ways, there are those people who are bona fide China experts who are following what China is doing externally. There are others who are bona fide Latin American experts who are seeing this from the perspective of one particular country or subregion, but trying to understand what really China is all about. And so I found that oftentimes some of the most interesting insights come from what I call the seams from, people who focus on China versus Latin America. And even within that, people looking at the dynamic from the perspective of the security community versus those who are looking at this from a business perspective. And even within the business community, you have those who look at in one sector, such as telecommunications, whose dynamics are very different from another sector, such as mining.
Administration has confirmed that China has been operating a spy base in Cuba since at least 2019. It's located about 100 miles from Florida. This comes after the Wall Street Journal reported that China tentatively agreed to pay Cuba billions of dollars to set up an electronic eavesdropping facility.
So, Evan, I think our window into this discussion and kind of the impetus behind this discussion was the recent news about China's activities in Cuba, which got a lot of scrutiny in the U.S. It made its way into the news cycle in the United States. It seems as though China are developing or building something called an ELINT. I think that's an electronic listening facility of some kind. Evan, tell us, what is this facility? How far along is the development?
Well, this is something that has probably been going on for quite some time. Indeed, back in the early 2000s, when I first began to follow China and Latin America, there were rumors even then that the electronic intelligence collection facilities that had been operated by the Soviet Union, the Russians, in a place called Lourdes or Bejucal, Cuba, and maybe a secondary computing facility in Santiago, had been handed over to the Chinese, or at least the Chinese were being allowed in by the Cuban government. And so there was never any official confirmation, but this was something that those of us who followed the region generally knew about and talked about and debated. And so the most recent revelations, of course, that the Chinese not only had been in the facility for some time, but as you might expect, apparently have been providing some money to the Cubans to upgrade the facility. And again, Chinese technology of the 2020s is a lot more modern than what they would have inherited from the Russians back 30 years ago. So that makes sense. But of course, in addition to the ELINT facility, which again was the story that was leaked by the Wall Street Journal, there was of course current negotiations apparently between China and Cuba over the possibility of Chinese military trainers working with Cuban soldiers on Cuba itself, which would not only increase an explicitly military presence, but it would also create opportunities for expanded collaboration. And by having at least an official Chinese military presence persistently on Cuba would also create certain other strategic challenges for the United States, given Cuba's proximity.
So you mentioned that this facility was probably already in development for a while. It had been on the radar of experts such as yourself prior to the Wall Street Journal story that kicked all this off. I mean, at the time when it first became apparent as an issue to experts, were you wishing that it got the kind of attention that it's getting now?
Well, to be perfectly frank, when it first came to the attention of the community following these things, it was a very different China that in the early 2000s was mostly doing economic things, that was very cautious about trying to avoid military activities or presenting what it was doing as a threat. And so this was the time when Panama had just given control over two very important port facilities, concessions to the Hong Kong-based firm Hutchison Whampoa. And so this during that time was part of the, is China a threat or is it not a threat? But in general, China was very cautious with Cuba, probably remembering the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, that this was a bit of a tripwire for the United States, and even was reluctant to recognize Cuba as what they call a strategic partner or a comprehensive strategic partner when they were giving those recognitions out to others, such as Mexico and Brazil, etc. And although China was doing some military things in the hemisphere, it was bringing people over to short courses in Changping, a National Defense University facility. It was selling limited quantities of weapons to the region. It was sending its hospital ship, the Peace Ark, from about 2011 sporadically to the region, and doing other things meant to look not too threatening, for example, sending peacekeepers to Haiti from 2004 to 2012. But so this was all kind of part of the background noise, trying to understand, well, there's clearly some presence there, but it was clearly trying to avoid taking actions that were seen as provocative. Now that China has become a little bit more provocative, both in Asia and elsewhere, it is beginning to be interpreted in a new light.
Do you think that this is a threat, Evan? Is this something that we should be very concerned about?
For me, China's principal goals in Latin America as elsewhere in the world are mostly about its own interests and mostly about economic interests. It wants to get secure access to the commodities that it needs for its industrial machine and capital formation, as well as the foodstuff to feed the 1.4 billion Chinese people. It wants to get access to markets in the region, especially in high-value goods and strategic sectors like telecommunications. And along the way, it wants to capture as much of the value added as possible. But the other piece of that is that China recognizes that it's doing all these things in a world that's not its own making, and so it needs to engage in the multilateral space. It needs to engage in the military space, in part because it anticipates that established powers like the United States may not allow it to surpass the United States in terms of power or military might. And so I really look at this with two minds. Number one, I do not see a nefarious Chinese plan to take over the world. And yet at the same time, I believe that responsible actors within the People's Liberation Army think about how they would have to fight a war with the United States, whether that starts over Taiwan or some other affair. And so the bottom line is, without suggesting that China is looking for a fight, if the United States ever found itself engaged in a fight with China, the fact that you would have options, whether personnel stationed in Cuba, electronic intelligence gathering facilities to be able to see the movement of forces or to collect information on the basic electronic profiles of U.S. weapons systems or facilities, as well as having other options to send teams into the region from close by to disrupt U.S. deployment and sustainment flows. Those types of things, for those of us who are responsible for thinking about, how we might have to defend the hemisphere in that future war fight, that Chinese presence does take on a certain relevance.
So you mentioned the parallels to 1962, which I think come to the mind of many Americans when they hear about a U.S. rival having a military presence on Cuba. It's quite different, though, isn't it? I mean, the nature of the threat, so to speak, for the lack of a better word, it's very dissimilar from what we experienced in the 1960s. Isn't that right?
Absolutely. First of all, it's important to recognize with the 1960s that you had a Soviet Union that was overtly looking to expand its influence and very much push a political, military, economic concept alternative to and replacing that of the West. And part of that was advanced through subversion, which you'd literally seen just 3 years before with the communist takeover with Fidel Castro and his revolutionaries. But frankly, it was moving what were then relatively a new concept of strategic nuclear weapons to a place which could allow a nuclear first strike against the United States with very little warning. And so, everything about the Soviet Union, Cuba, and nuclear missiles was very, very threatening. So it certainly was a different type of challenge than what we face now with China.
You mentioned, though, that the Chinese might think of Cuba as a place where they'd like to have a military presence in case relations deteriorate with the United States. Do you expect that this will expand in the coming years, this initiative?
The Chinese have always been very cautious, and particularly cautious in Latin America, which they regard as the U.S. near abroad. The strategic value is intuitive. For example, if you look at the places where China does not want the United States or its allies to be its own near abroad, the First Island chain, the Straits of Malacca, etc., the Chinese have gone to a lot of effort to develop an anti-access capability there. They've militarized islands in the South and East China Sea. They've developed what they call the 9-dash line, extending territorial claims and using the Chinese Coast Guard to push others out, et cetera, et cetera. So when you look at what's almost the exact same geography, the southeast maritime approaches to the United States, where we have a lot of sensitive military facilities, as well as logistics, et cetera, the Chinese recognize that they strategically want to be in that space. And so I do see the Chinese recognizing that utility. But at the same time, I think the Chinese have tried to avoid provoking the United States, at least as long as possible. But with the expansion of Chinese power and also with the style that Xi Jinping has brought to leadership in China, what you have is a China now more willing to assert what it believes its rights and its prerogatives, and accepting that, if it comes to, political or rather conflict with the United States, it's prepared to push back, as we've seen with things like its response to Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, just to name one issue.
Talking about the near abroad and that comparison, it's interesting because the U.S. probably does have a larger presence in the South China Sea than China have, at least on the military matter in the Caribbean. But in a way, you could perhaps look at the Cuba situation as quite provocative because it's even closer to the mainland of the United States than a lot of where the United States is positioned. I mean, you're talking about the Moluccas, not particularly close to mainland China. I suppose the Chinese might look at U.S. built up around Taiwan as part of their sovereign territory, but still, Cuba, it's only 100 miles away from the mainland United States. Is about as close as you can get, right?
Absolutely. And one can make the case that also the Straits of Malacca, although a little bit technically farther from mainland China, are very important because it's a maritime choke point that you have to pass through, in which a significant portion of the global maritime trade that feeds China You're absolutely right. And it's not actually just Cuba. For example, if you look at the Bahamas with Nassau, with the main island, literally about 55 miles from U.S. shores, you have a major Chinese commercial facility that, in time of conflict, could be leveraged for either special teams or intelligence gathering or other things, as well as Chinese port facilities in Mexico and in other architecture. So it's not just about Cuba. And again, frankly, it's really not about leading with military conflict. But again, I've, as a civilian, worked for the Department of Defense almost my entire career since the mid 1990s, and it's not that those of us, military or civilian, who work for Defense Department, look for conflict, but it's our job to think about, if that ever happened, how would one fight? How would our adversaries fight? And so, when I project myself into the planning of PLA officials, they would be irresponsible not to look at the options that they have through commercial facilities, in information architecture, basing agreements to say, what options, if we had to fight with the United States, would this create? And so it's really understanding how this changes the strategic space, rather than suggest that there's some sort of master plan that the Chinese are looking to go to war with the U.S.
So the facilities that you mentioned in the Bahamas and Mexico, they're commercial facilities. We perceive that it's possible that China could use them as a dual use position sometime in the future. But is this base that we're talking about, or this facility that we're talking about in Cuba, is it the only truly military installment that China have in the Caribbean?
Correct, or really anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. And so the Chinese have been very cautious not to look for explicit, basing agreements or military alliances in the way that the Soviet Union did during the Cold War. And in many ways, it just doesn't make sense for them to do so, because the Chinese, who are, as deeply entangled economically, financially with the United States, don't wish to either antagonize the United States and thus limit their access to U.S. markets, or antagonize others to see this as as a military rivalry. Having said that, what we have seen as the Chinese power has expanded, they have also expanded their military relationships. And so they first got into counter-piracy operations off the coast of Somalia. They extended that, of course, then to the second major global choke point, the first being Malacca from a Chinese standpoint, the second, of course, being the Suez Canal. And of course, the military base that they established in Djibouti reflects the need to be able to project power in that area. They are not quite in that position with the United States in the Western Hemisphere. And so, although there's been a lot of talk about other facilities that are operated by the Chinese, which could be used for military purposes, of course, La Union in El Salvador has been discussed. Certainly the port of Chancay, which is going to be operated, 15 berth deepwater port in Peru, has been talked about in that. But the Chinese have been reluctant to explicitly do military things. But what it is important to point out is you don't need that type of military agreement to have military consequences. So, for example, the port of Hanbantota, which after a debt move a couple of years ago was basically taken over by a Chinese operator. A couple of years back, when the Chinese wanted to put a PLA Navy ship, basically a electronic intelligence collection ship, into that port to refuel it and resupply it, they didn't need a military agreement. The fact that they were a port operator and the government was dependent on them was enough.
Evan, you talked about those key waterways, the Malaccas, and then the Suez Canal. There's also the Straits of Hormuz. And where I used to live, the United Arab Emirates, there's been this diplomatic issue where the United States are accusing the UAE and China of working together to get a military installment there. That's maybe the third most important waterway. And that brings us to the Panama Canal, right?
Absolutely. For the U.S., the Panama Canal, whose neutrality is guaranteed by treaty, has been a pretty important thing. Although I think sometimes it's easy for people to misunderstand what the Chinese are doing in Panama, because in strategic terms, given that Chinese also want to pursue strategic commercial objectives, Panama's role as a global logistics hub as well as a global financial center is probably in the short term every bit as important. And the influence that Chinese companies get over the government, over the families, that type of access is immediately probably more important than just the military role. Now, yes, in time of war, there are considerations. The possibility of, having liberty to, monitor what's going through. But because of that canal treaty, it's it would be pretty difficult for a Panamanian government, unless it was an explicitly, anti-U.S. populist one in sometime in the future, to violate its own international treaty obligations. Having said that, however, there are many different relatively easy ways to shut down the Panama Canal in times of conflict. Some just using insurance rates or electronic cyber attacks, but everything from putting a ship crosswise, a container ship in the Culebra Cut, one of the narrow areas in the canal area, to creating certain military risks at the mouth or inside the canal itself. Having said that, however, the Chinese, by shutting down the canal even in time of crisis, would actually be impeding their own economic situation, given how much they rely on that trans-Pacific commerce, more than necessarily impeding the United States, because the U.S. for years cannot bring its largest ships, its carriers, for example, through the canal. But if you did put on that wartime hat and you said, okay, in time of a conflict, you have a risk of being able to shut down the canal, it is also relevant that the secondary facility, for those of us who looked at basically Atlantic Pacific maritime transit, is the Straits of Magellan, of course, going all the way around South America. And so thus, in conjunction with China's presence in Panama, it's also relevant to look at China's presence there in Tierra del Fuego, in Ushuaia, including a new private port facility that for some creates the risk of China being able to not only observe, but in time of conflict, potentially be able to disrupt traffic that is going through that secondary choke point.
Evan, we've been talking a lot about how commercial ports could perhaps be used for a military purpose, but I do want to draw that contrast with the history and with the Cold War and with the Soviet Union. We talked about how this facility in Cuba is the only purely military or intelligence-focused facility that China have got in the Western Hemisphere. During the Cold War, how many proper military or intelligence bases did the Soviet Union have in the Western Hemisphere? How different is it in that regard?
Well, of course, what you regard as an intelligence base is all relative, but certainly, for example, when you had the Soviet allies, the Sandinistas in power from 1979 to 1990 with Daniel Ortega, the ability to essentially operate out of Nicaragua was a matter of concern, and certainly Cuba, of course, that was the fear with where things were going with El Salvador. But really, the number of actual bases were limited, although the Soviet Navy certainly operated, freely in both the Atlantic and Pacific during the Cold War. Having said that, when you speak about other facilities, again, what I tend to see is that on the one hand, within the domain of an actual war, some of the closer in facilities would almost certainly be used for things more special teams and intelligence gathering, rather than essentially staging PLA Navy ships. They're just, in military terms, just too close to the United States. It would make them too vulnerable for sustainability.
Evan, let's talk a little bit about how this looks from the Cuban perspective and why they're interested in helping the Chinese with this project. Of course, Cuba is a rival of the United States. There's been a long and fraught history, but it seems to me, based on some of the analysis that I've been reading as we were preparing for this discussion, that Cuba's motivation, at least in the immediate term, is quite economic. Is that correct?
Well, certainly, although Cuba has the pledge from the United States that it will not be militarily invaded by the United States. Cuba both has long seen itself as having security concerns and frankly, for its own survival, needing guarantors of rivals from the United States. Initially, that was the Soviet Union, and then Venezuela with the oil and other things. And so certainly Cuba has security concerns. But you're also right that particularly in the post-COVID environment, where something like a half of the European tourists who used to come into Cuba no longer come to Cuba. It had severe problems with economic, with supply of gasoline, with supply of foodstuffs. Literally, just in the past 2 years, you've seen over 520,000 Cubans leaving the island, on the order of what you saw with the Mariel boat lift, which was only 125,000, or, for example, in the period immediately from 65 on, where you had about 270,000 leaving. And so we're in a period of unprecedented economic crisis, producing unprecedented out-migration. And the Cubans are clearly desperate to work with anybody who can help keep them alive. And so certainly the fact that they would be willing to take these type of risks basically on a pay-for-play basis to allow the Chinese, who historically they have not fully trusted, to come in is a data point. And it complements other data points, such as bringing in and making some unprecedented offers to Russian investors who may be able to do something with respect to foodstuffs and petroleum, giving those Russian investors commitments to 99-year leases, leading to the recent announcement that Aeroflot is resuming Russian flights going into Cuba. Or, for example, the fact that the Cuba, who has been very reluctant to deal with the Iranians, also not wanting to put too high of a profile, has just about 2 weeks ago, for the first time since former Iranian President Rouhani's visit in 2016. So the first time in quite a number of years, received not only current Iranian President Ebrahim Raisi, but also his defense minister, but also with the prospect that Iran might be able to do something with Cuban refineries and maybe in the Cuban mining sector. So you're absolutely right. You're seeing across the board the Cubans willing to take risks, working with just about anyone, and probably anti-U.S. actors who may have something to bring to the table to keep their economy afloat, or at least stem the tide of economic difficulties that they're living.
Evan, you said something there that made my ears kind of perk up, which was that the Cubans historically haven't really trusted the Chinese. Can you tell me more about that? That sounds very interesting.
Absolutely, and it's a love-hate relationship. But as you recall, during the Cold War, when you had the Sino-Soviet split, the Cubans, of course, allied with the Soviet Union, and indeed in some places in Africa, for example, the Cubans actually found themselves on opposite sides from the Chinese of national revolutionary movements. In addition to that, even in the post-Cold War period, the Cubans, of course, then lost a little bit of their zeal for the Soviet Union and the Russians when you had that abrupt withdrawal of finance with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, especially in about 1993. And although the Russians tried to get back into the game, although the Chinese stepped up to a certain degree after the Russians left, there was always fear that the abilities of the Chinese Communist Party were in some ways in conflict with the self-preservation instincts of the Cuban Communist Party. And so you had a little bit of business, but the Chinese never recognized the Cubans actually as a strategic partner, something that they did with a number of other actors. The Cubans, although they would have some military-to-military consults, never really bought Chinese weapon systems. And just over the years, it's been a love-hate. And although on the one hand, there's a plaque in Cuba that says that of the Chinese who remained, there was never a Chinese defector against the revolution in those early days. But at the same time, the Cubans remember very well that most of the Chinese during the Batista days and the pre-revolutionary days who had property and shops actually all fled to Miami. It's long been a complicated relationship between Cuba and China. Indeed, even during the first time that we went to reestablish relations with Cuba during the Obama period, 2014 to 2015, it was interesting because the Chinese, who didn't think there was anything much to do to make money in Cuba, found themselves racing to play catch up once they found there might be access to the U.S. through the Cuban market. Chinese companies were racing back to get back into places like the port of Mariel, and so that complex relationship continues even today.
Evan, I mean, you touch on something that, of course, we had to get to in this discussion, which is the U.S. embargo and U.S. policy towards Cuba. Of course, during the Obama administration, just as you said, there was an effort to reach out to Cuba and try to get relations onto a better footing than they had been since the 1950s. But in the time since then, we've backed off and we've kind of reinstated our rather harsh embargo policy towards Cuba. I mean, that's my sense of the pattern. Is that a fair reading of how things have been over the last two administrations?
Yes and no. I mean, certainly there was a sense after the Obama engagement, which, as you recall, led to the releasing of a number of sanctions, the reestablishment of diplomatic relationships, the reopening of embassies, the taking of Cuba off of the terror watch list, and among a number of other things. There was a sense that Cuba's behavior in the region really didn't live up to what the Obama administration thought it was going to get for all of these carrots in economic reopening. And of course, not that long after President Obama's groundbreaking trip, presidential visit to Havana in 2016, you had, of course, President Trump's election and the new orientation, the sense that, maybe this had been taken too far and going back, as you alluded to previous policies. And so, and again, I worked for Secretary Pompeo 2019, 2020. And so, I saw this process, and it was really, it wasn't one thing overnight, but certainly, after the National Security Presidential Memorandum of 2017, you had the successive tightening of sanctions, a total of about 200 different sanctions, that to the point where also trying to cut off the ability of, for example, the Cuban regime to be able to make money off of remittances that were sent by Cubans destined for their families. And so you're right, you had that reimposition that probably helped to push the Cubans into a more defensive posture, and I think played a lot of good. There were always those who talked about the suffering of the Cuban people. Now, I would point out that during about the first 15 months of the Biden administration, and Biden actually being much more conservative than Trump had been, although he'd presided over that opening when he was President Obama's vice president. But during about the first 15 months, there wasn't a whole lot of action in terms of easing of Cuba's sanctions. But what you really saw was that in 2021, when the Cuban government clamped down on those unexpected nationwide protests, threw hundreds of people into jail, resorted to repressive measures, I think you began to see the reimposition of some sanctions by the Biden administration, especially against the Cuban National Police, against Interior Ministry personnel, and against selective others. Now, again, with Biden, as with Venezuela, you've seen an easing of some of the sanctions that were believed to have some of the gravest humanitarian effects. And so, for example, easing up on remittances and some other things. And so I would say that, President Biden has not gone back to where President Obama has. I think that era is long over. There was the sense of we just didn't get what we were hoping to get from that. But there has been an attempt to at least take the edge off of the sanctions to try to minimize the collateral effect on the Cuban people as much as possible.
I knew a professor at university who, and this was about 10 years ago, this was before Obama's effort to re-engage with Havana, and he told us the Capitol Hill policy perspective from a very cynical angle. He was someone who had been the chief of staff to a powerful Democratic congressman in the 1980s and had worked closely with Tip O'Neill on these kinds of matters, and had continued being the head of the freshman orientation program for new members on Capitol Hill. So he was very plugged into the Capitol Hill goings on. And what he told us was, this is why we have an embargo on Cuba. It's only a priority for one group of people in the United States, and that's the Cuban diaspora. And they live in Florida, and Florida is an important state politically. So we don't want to get on their bad side, and we will basically defer to them on the policy. And you're describing so many more rationales behind our policy. Maybe he was giving us too simplistic and too cynical a point of view, but political developments in the last few years have made me wonder if that dynamic might change. And it's particularly because Florida doesn't really seem to be a swing state anymore. It's now maybe more a state that's solidly on one side of the political aisle. And it makes me wonder if the salience of the perspectives of voters in Florida has reduced. And maybe it gives the Washington policymakers a little bit more freedom of action as we develop Cuba policy. What do you think about that?
Well, in my personal opinion, the idea that this is all just cynical electoral politics is probably, it does a discredit those who have thought leadership. And there are a number of those who happen to be in South Florida. And yes, it's absolutely true that you have a, massive diaspora of people who, live the expropriation of their properties in the Cuban Revolution, and that they have become, very influential, and they have a voice within the Republican Party, but also within the Democratic Party. I mean, you talk about somebody like Senator Bob Menendez, who, I think to his credit, understands these issues fairly well. are there electoral considerations? Maybe to some degree, but I'm not sure whether a perceived change in the importance of Florida is going to change the policy. To me, what has really kind of happened is that the question of the changing role of Cuba in Latin America, the changing role of the dynamics of the region itself, and of course we have to talk about Venezuela in that regard, has also led to an evolution of how to do these things. And so, certainly, within the House and Senate, those voices who really see the threat from Cuba and the consequences of communism, do try to keep up that pressure. And at the same time, you have people like, for example, National Security Head, Juan Gonzalez, or others, who maybe take a different approach on how we engage with Cuba in Venezuela. And I think again, clearly the Biden administration is a different team with a different perspective of how to balance pressure and carrots and sticks, and I respect that. But so it's maybe a little bit electoral politics, but I think it's also a little bit of people guided by thought leaders talking about what's important and how you get change and what you need to be worrying about.
So you talked about the carrots and sticks. Do you perceive that the Biden administration will approach, or have already begun approaching since about a month since the Wall Street Journal story, this ELINT matter with carrots, sticks, both, neither? How do you see their policy approach about maybe trying to reach out to the Cubans or trying to find more punitive measures?
Well, to be perfectly frank, I'm not really sure there is a whole lot that we have the latitude to do right now. My sense is that there is a pretty clear commitment, not to use military force, that would be probably counterproductive. And so, short of military force in dealing with sovereign, states, you have, options like targeted sanctions. You have options dealing with partners. Of course, the Europeans with people like Joseph Borrell are, we'll see what happens with the future European Union leadership, depending on the outcome of Spain's elections. But at the end of the day, the U.S. just doesn't have a whole lot of good options. I believe that there was an attempt to speak with both the Chinese as well as the Cubans to try to discourage this from going much farther. But again, reminding ourselves that this was something that, as the administration has noted, we knew about at least from the upgrade in the 2019 era. And so, if the Cubans, have not backed down now, and indeed are basically doubling down, reaching out to the Russians, reaching out to the Iranians, it's unlikely that that will change anytime soon. Now, the one thing that I will say is that as I look at the group that we oftentimes lump together as is the bad actors, and the Ortegas in Nicaragua, Maduro in Venezuela, and Diaz-Canel and the Cuban regime. To me, actually, Diaz-Canel in Cuba, which remembers 1962, which understands the vulnerability to embargoes, especially with respect to dependence on oil, etc., has actually been a little bit less enthusiastic about inviting in threat actors to take risks than has his other two counterparts have. Now, that hasn't been an absolute limit, as we've seen with the Iranian visit just recently, with the Russian visit. But my sense is that there is some receptivity in terms of Cuba, that while it tries to maintain its own sovereignty and regime survival, something that they've been very adept at, it sometimes plays it a little bit smarter to try to not, on the one hand, you can, receive, as they've done, a Russian, missile frigate in Havana Harbor and show it off as a reminder of what they can do. And yet at the same time, I don't think that Diaz-Canel is looking to pick a fight with the United States. And so there may be certain limits that, in terms of what they do with the Chinese or the Russians, that they will stay away from crossing certain lines.
Because you mentioned some of the other countries in the region and the way they think about U.S.-China, there's been a trend over the last couple of years that's been called the pink wave, especially in South America, but in Latin America, where left-wing politicians, political parties have won a lot of major elections. In Brazil with Lula, in Chile with Gabriel Boric, in Peru, all of the events in Bolivia, they kind of, I guess they call it a coup and then reverse coup. I don't want to get into characterizing because I know it's controversial. But then in Colombia, I think it was the first time that a left-wing candidate had ever won an election there. So do we view this as a kind of universally anti-American phenomenon because many of the left-wing political parties are thought of as being anti-American, or is there a lot more nuance there? I know that Gabriel Boric gave a speech about Russia and Ukraine that was received very positively in the United States. Maybe the younger generation think about things in less of a Cold War mindset. I mean, how do you feel that the U.S. is and should be reacting to this phenomenon of left-wing victories across South America?
Well, first, let me say I do certainly think that the Biden administration does have a very nuanced view, maybe at times even a little bit too nuanced in terms of the opportunities to work with some of these actors. But as you also pointed out, what's called the pink wave or the pink tide is really only the latest of a series of ebbs and flows, although I would say that this one is different. And so it was at the beginning of the 2000s when we had Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, when we have Evo Morales in Bolivia, Rafael Correa in Ecuador, that we were talking about the first pink tide, so to speak. And even within that, you could talk about those who are more anti-U.S. populists versus those such as the first term of Lula in Brazil, or frankly, the Concertación in Chile, which were seen as more centrist leftists, but committed to democracy. Really the enduring problem is that governments on both the right and the left in Latin America as elsewhere have not been able to solve the enduring problems of the region: underdevelopment, inequality, corruption, insecurity, etc. And really, with COVID-19 and the inflationary effects of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, those problems have only gotten deeper. You've had a deepening of poverty, a push into the informal sector despite at least formal economic recoveries. You've had governments with fiscal balances which have forced them to do things like eliminate subsidy programs and increase taxes in oftentimes unpopular ways. COVID-19 itself really exposed what people in Latin America were already frustrated with: government mismanagement and corruption, indeed over things like ventilator sales and et cetera, et cetera. And so I think what we're seeing right now, this new wave, number one, it's responding to some of those same things. However, it is different and more concerning for a number of different reasons. First, the scale of that wave on both the right and left are unprecedented. And so to me, what I would say is, on the one hand, you have those states which are fundamentally populist, leftist, authoritarian regimes, which have been consolidating their control and essentially using the media and what I would call lawfare to do away with the last vestiges of political opposition and NGOs and others. That's, again, Nicaragua after the hijacking of 2021 elections. It's, of course, Venezuela now, the latest vestige being the disqualification of Maria Corina Machado, arguably, the front runner for the opposition, there, et cetera. But in addition to those, I think we would all say, anti-democratic actors. You have a range of others. And in some cases, you have actors that are moving in an increasingly worrisome direction. I would put Xiomara Castro in Honduras in that category. You would have others such as President Petro in Colombia, who still, while wanting to work with the United States, has been really very vociferous in doing a lot of other things that create difficulties for U.S. policy objectives, whether it's his approach to the war on drugs or his re-embrace of Maduro. Certainly Lula, with his desire to expand BRICS with pretty much a whole raft of anti-U.S. actors, as well as to embrace China much more vociferously. And then on the what I would call the principled left, you have somebody like Gabriel Boric, who I would say, although in a politically very fragile condition and maybe moving towards economically relatively unwise policy, but has been, I would say, to his credit, very principled in calling out the authoritarians, whether it's the Russians or others. And important to recognize that even on the right side, all of the problematic actors are not just on the left. And so, you have Nayib Bukele, who has become enormously popular by essentially imposing a state of emergency and throwing anybody who looks like a gang member in prison and terrorizing them there. Or, for example, the once very strongly U.S. allied regime of President Giamatti in Guatemala, which again essentially trying to use the control of the judiciary and the Attorney General's office to basically rig the election to prevent an anti-system candidate. So I think across the spectrum, what we have is a range range of different challenges. But the problem is that number one, in all of those cases, those governments, although we, the U.S., I think the Biden administration has found common ground in areas like working together on environmental issues or working together on marginalized groups or anti-corruption issues. But the problem is in terms of their interest in the multilateral space, some of their willingness to engage with the PRC, or in some cases, Russia, in the case of Lula or AMLO in Mexico. Even though we can say, well, we can still work with them, it really raises some real issues of the risks that it brings in the hemisphere for the United States and the ability of the United States to advance its strategic agenda. So, and the last thing I'll say on this is that something that is there with this wave that you didn't have before is the availability of China, basically to bankroll regimes as they move in a anti-Western direction or against the private sector. And so it's not that China is looking to overthrow regimes, but what happens is as these regimes wish to pursue another path, is they get themselves into a fiscal mess, as is the case with Argentina right now. The very propensity of those statist regimes to get themselves into crises creates a situation in which the region moves almost inherently farther towards China. And frankly, Chinese money helps to sustain regimes making bad decisions far beyond where we saw the situation in the previous decade, where we started moving towards the last pink tide.
It's interesting you're talking about the democratic backsliding that's been occurring in several countries. And this is something that the Biden administration have indicated that they view as a real strategic issue, a strategic priority, that they wanted to orient U.S. foreign policy in a couple different ways. One, to support the middle class at home. That's been a big theme. And then another is this issue of democracy and authoritarianism, and thinking about the world in those terms, something that's been poorly received in my area in the Middle East, certainly, but is something that they've certainly prioritized. When we hear them talking about this, there's some common examples. We hear about Hungary, Turkey, India. We don't hear very much about Latin American countries. And it reminds me that we really don't hear that much about Latin American countries in general from the major principles of U.S. foreign policy. Of course, we have branches or offices inside of all of our agencies that focus on the Americas and the Western Hemisphere. But the principles atop U.S. foreign policy, President Biden, Secretary Blinken, Sullivan, you don't hear very much about Latin America from them. Do you think that we are falling behind, that we're not giving it its due priority, and that we're allowing these trends to go in the direction that we don't like?
Yeah. Well, you raise a couple of important issues. And number one, I do believe that the lack of attention to Latin America isn't quite as bad as those of us who, are engaged with the region, oftentimes, lament. Certainly people, within those organizations, as you point out, Assistant Secretary Nichols on the state side, certainly General Richardson on, U.S. Southern Command side, and General, Van Herk on NORTHCOM, give lots of attention, to these issues. Oftentimes the problem has been, number one, there has been a lack of allocation of resources relative to, for example, our pivot to Asia or other concerns. Number two, even as we have a recognition of attention for more resources, for example, the idea of some Latin America focused things in Build Back Better World, talk of a $4 billion basically care package for Central America, but Washington being politically polarized and broken, a lot of that money just is not happening right now. Some of our most important engagement organizations, such as the Development Finance Corporation or USAID, have some significant policy issues that impair them from being as effective as they could be. And so, you have a range of, I think, different problems. Part of the issue, however, also was that it wasn't so much neglect, I would say. You can count various different leader visits and things like that. We just had the Summit of the Americas, although, to a very unfortunate result. But there's been a paucity of what I would call strategic thinking, because Latin America has not gotten that much money, even though you've gotten the trips and the speeches. What you haven't had is the level of resources that lead senior people outside of Latin America to think about Latin America strategically. I defy you to say, to name a great U.S. geopolitical strategic thinker best known for Latin America.
Rutherford B. Hayes, right? Negotiating that Paraguay deal his only legacy.
Exactly. But the other thing, and I think you call it a really important point. And I absolutely agree with the posture of the current administration in the importance of values. I think the importance of values going back to Ronald Reagan and before is an enduring part. And indeed, it's part of the attack from China, trying to undermine our ability to stand for certain things like democracy and human rights. The dilemma, however, is that in the current era where China is able to put up its money with the proliferation of illiberal regimes, the way in which you can fight for democracy is different than what it was in the Cold War. Because the problem we're running into now is that China puts up this alternative to say, well, lots of definitions of democracy, lots of human rights, and so if you're imprisoning your people and doing this, well, who's to say it's not democracy? So the problem has been in this era in which there are financial and other options, the critical efforts by the Biden administration, I think, to lead with democracy or lead with human rights, in many ways have backfired because it's, through sanctions policies and other things, have basically pushed illiberal states more deeply into the China camp. And so to me, the challenge is how to lead with democracy and use that critical weapon of value, but do it in such a way that you actually don't create exactly the opposite effect that which you intend, which is to push your partners into the camp of those who don't bother them about things like values.
So there's been a series of recent high-level meetings between the United States and China in an effort to get relations back on a more stable footing. Janet Yellen, Secretary Blinken, they visited China. There's been a lot of interaction with China. So is Latin America on the agenda when principals at the highest level meet each other? Do they talk about Latin America, the U.S. and Chinese at that level?
Well, I think to a certain degree, and it's interesting. If you go back to 2006, when you actually had within the U.S.-China strategic and economic dialogue, you actually had a Latin America subchapter. I remember Arturo Valenzuela, then Secretary of State, later Roberto Jacobson. It even went back to the time of Tom Shannon. Now, I believe that technical thing has been off the table, although it probably would be a productive thing to do. But I will also say that I think you do see in some of those talks, even, for example, obviously, Cuba was front and center when Secretary Blinken went over to the PRC. And you actually saw with the Guatemalan elections that you had, I think, again, at the secretary's level, some messaging. So I won't say that it's off the table for any actors. But I think the other thing to recognize is that our relationship with China is getting very fraught. And really, there's been different cycles. I think, to their credit, the Biden administration is trying to, at least maintain channels open without ceding, important ground. But to me, it goes back to Anchorage. I think there were some possibilities for Biden to take things in a different direction. But again, with Tiger Wang Yi and the way in which both Secretary Blinken and Jake Sullivan really just kind of got slapped down by this aggressive new Chinese approach. And then there was the Wendy Sherman trip, which again, the Chinese pushed back very, very hard. And then, of course, the pressure over Taiwan. So I think there's an attempt to at least keep a door open, but there's really been a lot of pushback. And so I think what you don't want to be at the end of the day is being that person with a cup at the door saying, please talk to me, please talk to me. And again, I think Secretary Blinken did the right thing. I think the follow-up, especially with somebody like Janet Yellen, did the right thing. I doubt we're going to get to a President Biden visit, and it's lamentable that we're not getting Defense Secretary Austin opening the door, at least have a door opened for him, given that there is a critical military dimension of these tensions. And so I think certainly the Biden administration is trying. Certainly Latin America is increasingly one of those pieces on the table, but we have a long way to go.
I suppose that defense meeting, we missed the opportunity in Singapore a few weeks ago. We had a discussion with one of your CSIS colleagues about that summit in Singapore and about that missed opportunity. But Evan, you mentioned Guatemala and you mentioned Taiwan, and it brings me to another question that I was hoping that we could fit in while we have time, which is that of the very few countries in the world that recognize Taiwan as the Republic of China and have formal relations, several of them are in the Americas. There's Guatemala, Belize, Haiti, Paraguay, I think a couple countries in the Lesser Antilles in that island chain. So this is pretty interesting while we're talking about China's increasing engagement in the Americas, because I'm wondering if China are working to wean these countries off from Taipei. Is that happening? And do we think that some of those countries are going to de-recognize the ROC and switch to Beijing anytime in the near to medium term future?
Absolutely. And it is cyclic and it is impactful in terms of China's broader advance. It's cyclic to the extent that this was ongoing. The last major cycle, Costa Rica in 2007 was the last country to flip. And then you had a period of time in which China was trying to play nice, pursuing rapprochement of Taiwan until the DPP government came back into power in 2016, and that truce fell apart. And so what we saw literally from then was a series of countries being flipped little by little. So first Panama, later Dominican Republic, then El Salvador. U.S. pushed back very hard, and the Chinese in the region stepped back just a little bit. We've now entered a new wave with an increasingly desperate Nicaragua regime with the Ortegas, flipping about a year and a half ago. Of course, Honduras being the most recent flip. Now some nervousness with respect to where Guatemala is going with the prospects of a President Bernardo Arevalo, who has said that he's going to stick with Taiwan, but it's somewhat uncertain. As you pointed out, there has been some concern in the Caribbean, especially with St. Vincent and Nevis. You also have, of course, St. Lucia, which seems to be sticking with the Taiwanese for now. The worry with Haiti is that if you ever get a legitimate post-Ariel Henry government, just about everyone that is interested in governance in Haiti would want to deal with the PRC. But what I see is it's not just about diplomacy. What happens time and time again is that the opening of the door, the diplomatic flip, rapidly expands the Chinese presence. You have typically 10 to 20 non-transparent MOUs which are signed, which usually buy off the politically well-connected business classes. You usually have a training program for the ministries of foreign affairs, as has happened in Honduras. You usually have new journalistic programs, the opening of a new Confucius Institute. And so especially in these relatively small, influenceable countries like we have with Honduras, that really sets the stage for China not only to move forward very quickly in terms of its influence. These are some of the countries which are of the closest in Central America, the Caribbean, to U.S. shores. And the other piece of that, given that President Xi in China would probably really like to resolve the Taiwan question before the end of his unprecedented third term, the fact that as you move towards zero countries recognizing Taiwan, the temptation of an already militarily grossly superior PRC to combine that superiority with the desire to move with the sense of Taiwan's isolation, that those things together move you towards an action which could ultimately lead to war is a real risk. And so, to me, every one of those flips, it's not just about the PRC advancing very close to U.S. borders. It's also about the question of the strategic stability and frankly, avoiding a war in Southeast Asia.
It's really such an incredible dynamic, Evan, isn't it? Because a country like Belize, it's quite a small country, probably hardly ever thought about in places like Riyadh or Delhi, and is also so far away from the South China Sea. But it's a real player in this situation. And just like you said, what is viewed as one of the most dangerous potential flashpoints anywhere in the world, the events there might in some way be determined by the decisions of a country like Belize.
Absolutely. It's certainly one piece. And for the moment, that the POP government in Belize has indicated its strong commitment to stay with Taiwan, but there are always upcoming elections. But as you pointed out, it's really two things. It's one, the strategic impact is you lose some of those governments, especially some of the larger governments, and the other piece, frankly, is that those countries, Taiwan is actually a very good friend and a diplomatic influence within the region itself in terms of development, in terms of working with the U.S. and various different aid programs, the Development Finance Corporation, for example. And so every time you lose one of Taiwan's anchors in the region, you also, frankly, lose a basis for U.S.-Taiwan friendship and collaboration, in my judgment, for the benefit of countering the PRC offer and other malign activities elsewhere in the region.
Well, I suppose the U.S. then are asking some of these countries to do something that the U.S. doesn't even do ourselves, which is recognize Taiwan as the Republic of China. That's also a strange dynamic, isn't it?
Absolutely, and that's unfortunately something that since that very difficult choice back in the Cold War area, we've stuck with and continue to honor that commitment. And yet, at the same time, you're right to say, okay, well, indeed, the PRC oftentimes leverages exactly that message as those within those countries which would like to flip, saying, well, the U.S. recognizes the PRC, why don't you? Now, the one thing that I will say is that a luxury that the U.S. has had is to maintain it's the Taiwan Commercial Representative Office, TECRO, in the United States, and not a whole lot that the PRC is able to do about it, as well as our AIT office in Taiwan. What you see is when Latin American states would have dared to try to make that choice, saying, okay, we want to have diplomatic relations with the PRC, but still continue interacting with Taiwan, such as Guyana, our friendly PPP government, where then Foreign Minister Hugh Todd, dared to suggest that Guyana would open up a Taiwan office there, and literally within hours, that the pressure the PRC brought down obliged the poor Guyanese government to reverse its position. So it's the U.S. has had certain luxuries in its Taiwan relationship that other governments in the region, when they choose to flip, they essentially in their position lose those rights.
Well, Evan, I would love to continue this conversation. I'm sure that our listeners feel the same way, but we're at time now, and we've actually used even more of your time than we asked for. So I just want to thank you again for coming on here with us and sharing your expertise.
John, a real pleasure to be able to share this time with you, and certainly appreciate your interest and the interest of the audience in this topic.